Most of you are familiar faces, familiar names, but just to give you a very quick glimpse, I'm Engin Ayaz. I'm one of the co-founders of ATÖLYE, and for the last 6, 7 years, we've been on a path to explore what type of creative services the organization we might grow and build that is fit to this century's needs. Right as we stand, we have a strategic design studio and a creative hub, and an academy is a new exploration that we have started earlier this year. And our purpose is to cultivate a fertile environment to catalyze individuals and organizations to thrive together for the better. And given that we're all locked in our homes, there is no better platform to do this than webinars. And that's why for the last few weeks, we've been very actively exploring this thread. And ATÖLYE Academy is focusing on 3 areas: creative leadership, radical collaboration, and systems design, because we believe that this triangle of skills are very relevant in any future that might emerge, and are basically foundational tools to address the difficult problems that we're facing in the world. And facilitation is another important angle of where we're coming from, because we don't think that the world where experts come and tell us or tell you what is happening or how to read the world, that day and age is over. But the day of watching, listening, sensing, and then understanding what type of collective intelligence emerges, that feels a lot more relevant. And with that, if we have a strong community of change makers in Istanbul, in Turkey, and beyond, we feel that we can then tap into this collective potential and then see where it takes us. We don't even know what all the possibilities might be. So we are doing a lot of events. This is one of them. We're doing a lot of workshops, more to individuals as well as to companies, and then also running more structured programs. And alongside Academy, another key tenet for ATÖLYE has always been long-term thinking. And this actually was a very personal effort just about 3 weeks ago, where I felt personally really overwhelmed with all the stuff that I was reading and consuming in some ways, and felt the need to write, to reflect, to have some point of view. And it didn't matter what it was the most accurate or relevant. It was just the act of writing that helped me just gain my compass. And this writing also was very much informed by the conversations that I've been having with Noah and his close circle of practitioners and friends, which he will talk more about. That was basically a WhatsApp group where a deluge of amazing ideas were emerging, which Noah then skillfully converted into a narrative of possible scenarios for Europe and North America that he will be sharing with us. So in terms of agenda, I just want to make sure that we all have a voice before Noah starts speaking. So as part of check-in, we'll do 3 very simple exercises using chat. And after that, Noah will present. We will have breakout rooms that you will be assigned to automatically. For 20 minutes, you'll be talking with 3 other people, some prompts, some reflections based on the prompts that we're sharing. And the way we will go about it is that we will also use Google Slides to capture all of this. So these prompts based on your room will help you fill certain things so that we have some memory of what emerged in this process. And then we'll get some questions based on your conversations. We believe we'll get some really interesting questions for Noah, and then a quick checkout exercise. And for check-in, let's start by just all of us finding out a little bit more about each other. Just 1 second. I think, Barbaros, can you post the question on? Yeah, so let's also see each other at this point, because I think it makes a huge difference. So at least for now, if you don't mind turning your cameras on. I know it's tiring to look at the camera the whole day, but yeah, so this is a very simple one. just share, your name is already written, so just share your profession and your location. And I think it's kind of a beautiful moment when it's done all at once. So once you write, I'll just say 1, 2, 3, and we'll just have a flurry of um, just beautiful notes popping up. So that's, you're probably ready. So 1, 2, 3, and let's see it coming. Yeah, so it's quite a range. Designers, people from Milan, Dubai, Bursa, Amsterdam. Wow, quite amazing. Saudi Arabia, Bogota, Izmir, consultants, psychologists, strategists, sound designers, lecturers. Wonderful. This is amazing. This is the beauty of digital world, is that we're getting far more diversity that we could ever host at ATÖLYE. So it's beautiful. Thanks for being here. And let's skip to the next one. We just want to gauge your expectations a little bit. Today I showed up here because, and just put in whatever feels fitting. You can be authentic. Feel free. This is a safe zone. So, Barbaros, can you post that question too? Yeah. So today I showed up here because. So let's say 1, 2, 3, and let's see it coming. So here we're seeing curiosity, escaping the present, feeling hopeful. Curiosity again, lots of curious minds. That's not surprising. Finding out more about futures design, inspiration, sense making, brain food, foresight. Because Noah's a superstar, that's great. I agree. um, Worldwide community conversation, long-term vision. Yeah, thank you. This is beautiful. And the last one. Right now, I feel. So let's turn off our brains and move to our hearts. Uh, how do you feel right now? It's coming. Nice. Starting off on a positive note, a lot of excited, connected, chilled people. Naturally, some overwhelmed and confused people, tired, anxious, restless. I think we're all fluctuating in any given day between all of these, I would say. Hopeful, pessimistic, expectant, calm, chilled, connected, tired yet hyped, complicated, curious. Well, yeah, so that's that's quite a range. So with that, I'd like to introduce Noah. Personally, I met Noah 1.5 years ago, about when we first in Dubai, exploring what we could do with IDEO, Palmwood, and Dubai Future Foundation. And from the very early days, I felt like I had a very good chemistry and connected on different levels. And as we were going back and forth in Dubai, the conversation deepened. And personally, I've been always very excited about the domain of speculative design, foresight, futures. Although it's been hard to find the right conversations space in Turkey, at least in my reality, to think about these in structured ways. So when Noah recently invited me to be a part of that WhatsApp circle about 1.5 months ago, that was kind of my lifeblood as the world was turning upside down. And as we then decided with Academy to do more online webinars and engagements, I felt like the most fitting theme that we can hold on to, the red thread, is the future, what it holds, the tensions that it holds, and what future tense means for all of us. So I can't think of a better person to kick off this series. So no, on to you. Oops, we don't hear you. Yeah, now it should work.
There we go. Hi, guys. Can you? Yes, you can't hear me. So, I mean, you can't respond, but I can tell you can hear me. So I'm doing something a little bit unconventional because I am sequestered in a bunker in the mountains on a very bad Wi-Fi connection. So I'm streaming video on my laptop while it's calling in on my phone. So apologies for the dual screen here. But just to underline what Engin said, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you guys. And, you know, I remember when it was a novel thing to have a group conference call with more than like 10 people on it. And now this is something which is becoming a tedious part of our lives in many respects. So the chance to actually use one of these tools like Zoom and talk to really interesting people such as yourself is a joy, especially about something so important like the way the world is changing and what might the world look like. So I wanted to take the opportunity to thank you guys for coming and to thank Engin and the whole ATÖLYE crew for hosting this. As he rightly pointed out, it's rare as we're all struggling to keep our jobs or find new work or try and figure out what we do. You know, do we buy another bread machine, or do we get more canned food, or do we go home and protect our parents, or, you know, to start to think about the bigger picture here. And yet it is so important now, given the degree of uncertainty at the bigger picture, that those daily actions need to be informed by some bigger perspective of what might happen in tomorrow. So I wanted to take the opportunity to share a little bit about how futurists and sort of design futurists approach these kinds of dynamic moments of change. Share a little bit about the work which I do professionally at the Dubai Future Foundation. But I wanted to take the majority of the time to discuss about something which is not work related, and that is a large international group of kind of secret society futurists and designers and technologists who are spread around the world, who have been engaged in this collective sense-making exercise about what might happen after COVID. And I think they have a particularly interesting approach, and I've gotten permission to share some of the thinking that they've been doing in terms of 3 scenarios of what the future might look like if COVID-19 takes a year or more to resolve. And that's the key pivot point. We all are trying to get back to normal as quickly as possible. But as I think their research shows, there's a real distinct possibility that this is going to take a while to resolve. And when it does resolve, it's going to be a very different world than we left a few months ago. So I was going to take the chance to explore that, because it's rare that they agree to allow this stuff out in public or semi-public here. And I think they're going to be trying to share this a little bit more broadly in the coming weeks as well. So you guys are getting a bit of a preview of coming attractions. And if you have any input or ideas, I know we have a workshop breakout session after this, and I'll be able to take this back to them and feed that in. So you never know where that will go. With that, why don't I get into it? Does that sound good? Thumbs up if that sounds good. Jazz hands if that sounds awesome. Okay, super jazz hand lag, but I'm seeing some smiling faces. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen here, and we'll get right into it. So as Engin mentioned, I'm the futurist in chief and the chief of global affairs for a really special organization based in Dubai in the UAE called the Dubai Future Foundation. And the foundation has many initiatives, most perhaps visible of which is this Museum of the Future, which you see in the distance behind my coworker here, the peacock. And the foundation is a really unique global organization. It's a wholly government-owned foundation, so entirely public sector oriented. And we're responsible for around 35 or 40 major initiatives, including the Museum of the Future and training courses in the Dubai Future Academy and technology accelerators and Dubai Future accelerators and prototyping labs and research institutes and publishing partnerships. But in a nutshell, you know, the Future Foundation's mandate is to look over the horizon and onto our peripheral vision. So to try to imagine in a rigorous way what tomorrow might look like, and then take that as insights back and feed them into the creative policymaking process and the economic development process of Dubai and the UAE. But not but, you know, and that's a really hard task. So anyone who has tried to start to imagine what the next couple of years look like, not to mention like 20 years or so, will realize that human beings in general, but also organizations in particular, are generally very, very bad at predicting the future. You know, most of our companies, most of our organizations, most of our lives are set up to manage slow change in our environment. You know, we think we have an understanding of the way the world works, and we optimize our fit with that environment to the degree that we can. but history has shown that there are events which are unfortunately more frequent than we tend to admit that radically transform things. And you know, why don't we perceive those events? Why is it that we keep getting surprised by these things which, you know, politicians or like public intellectuals like to get up on TV in the evening news and say, no one could have predicted this. But yet there are people who have consistently not only predicted these kinds of changes, but identified them happening in real time. And the reason is because we're actually not just bad at predicting the future, we're actually quite bad at perceiving the present. As individuals and as groups, you know, we walk around with these little simulations in our mind, these mental models of how we think the world works. And those are just that, they're simulations. And even if, let's say we have the benefit of the doubt and we start out with very, very accurate simulations to begin with, you know, the world is constantly changing. So over time, our understanding of the way the world works grows out of sync with the way the world is actually working, or the way the world is constantly changing. And it's that gap which constantly gets us in trouble. So it's that gap between what we think is happening and what we think is important and what is actually changing. I used to show this slide when I would teach university, which is a slide of stock prices in the 1930 stock market crash, 1929, 1930. And this is a graph which shows the stock price over time. And these are little quotes from the most famous and intelligent and powerful people at the time, starting with, you know, the world's best economist at the time, John Maynard Keynes, who, you know, just a year before the stock market crash said, we will not have any more crashes in our time. And the stock market keeps going up. And then the president of one of the world's biggest companies says, there will be no interruption of our permanent prosperity. And we have reached a permanent plateau of stock prices, one of the world's greatest economic historians. And then there's a bit of a crash, and the bank says, don't worry, this isn't that big of a deal, it's not going to affect us. And it keeps going down. And then, you know, all of the powerful academics, in this case, the Harvard Economic Society in the 1930s, say the present depression has just about spent its force, and it keeps going down. Stabilization is clearly possible until finally the president announces that all banks are closed and all safety deposit boxes have been closed. So within a short period of time, you have extremely intelligent, well-informed, well-versed people who either can't or refuse to see the way the world is changing around them. And I used to use this slide a lot, but now I actually have a new slide, a better slide, which demonstrates similar examples. This is these are quotes from a famous president of the United States over time, over the last few months, starting at the end of January, saying, we have shut this thing down. It's going to be fine. And then saying, it's going down. It's going to disappear soon. This is totally not real. This is just a hoax, until there's a declaration of national emergency, and then the post hoc rationalization saying, I always knew this was real. This is a pandemic, right? So these are obviously funny examples, but the reason that we tend to be caught by surprise in these cases again and again is that our understanding of the world doesn't match up with the way the world changes. And for those of you who are a little bit old enough to remember this image from the old movie Predator with Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Predator was this predator, this evil alien from outer space who was there to hunt people. And he had the ability to slowly become invisible and camouflaged into the environment around him. We assume it was a him. We don't know. It wasn't a gendered alien. And people in general are very bad at detecting slow change. And also when uncomfortable things are occurring, if you remember the movie, some of the people started to realize that something was wrong as they were on this journey and their teammates were getting killed. But there were very strong social forces in the group which were working against the acknowledgement of that. Because acknowledging that something is fundamentally different that you don't understand is terrifying and threatening. So what futurists do is very much like what anthropologists and designers and you guys might do in your practice, is constantly try to interrogate our understanding, our mental models of the present, and fact check that or check that against the way the world might be changing. So we look for strange anomalous behaviors, for things we can't understand, for fringe cases, for edge cases, for gaps opening up in something that is possible that wasn't possible before. And in doing so, we try to re-perceive the present, which is a phrase from Keith Vanderheiden, one of the godfathers of scenario planning and one of my mentors. And it's that ability to perceive change before others do, which actually helps lead to a competitive advantage. So, you know, this is essentially what's behind entrepreneurial activities. This is a quote from Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley venture capitalist. And in his book, 0 to 1, he identifies this perceptual arbitrage, the ability to identify something by identifying a change which you can see, but others don't see yet, and responding to that before they wake up. That's the essence of foresight. In William Gibson's, one of his latest book series, there's a character who develops a stock market algorithm which can predict the stock market just 20 seconds in advance, and he becomes the most wealthy man in the world. Because even having the ability to see how things are changing at that small scale helps you understand the way the world is changing. But it's not just perceiving things first, it's actually about having the emotional and the social support to be able to process that and then understand what that means. So this is where this kind of semi-secret group that I mentioned beforehand comes in handy, because this is an organization which is spread all over the world, from Singapore to San Francisco, from Stockholm to Soweto, and these are people who are in positions of being on the front line. They might be in powerful positions, they might be in research positions, they might be designers, they might be artists, but they're all out there in different parts of the way the world is changing. And collectively, as a whole, they try to keep each other up to date on how things are changing, and also make sense of this socially and emotionally. What does it mean? So as COVID-19 started to break in Asia first and start to gradually work its way westward, this group proved to be an extremely interesting sense-making device, as Engin mentioned, to really try to feel what this meant, right? Okay, it's a whole different thing when you read on the news and see 10,000 people have died in Wuhan, but unless you have a personal connection to someone who lives in Hubei or who is being affected by that, it's just a number. It's just a statistic. So the group boiled their insights and put their brains together to create what they're calling a gray briefing. So this is totally and utterly unrelated to the Dubai Future Foundation, totally and utterly unrelated to my day job in that sense. And I'm just sharing this because I think it's an interesting opportunity to share some work that they've done. But they call it a gray briefing because nothing's never black. It's never black or white. And the key question that they were investigating here is encapsulated in this slide. So what would happen if Europe and North America, so they're focusing particularly on Europe and North America, what would happen to Europe and North America if COVID-19 lasted a year or more? I just want to pause to let that sink in, right? Some of us in countries have been under quarantine for weeks now at this point. Some of us are now just are still able to walk out in the streets, right? The question of how long is this going to last is really, really salient. And most of the conversation around this is a rush to get things back to normal. And this is, I think, a profound question, and I could be wrong, but this is the only place I've ever seen it asked, which starts to really explore what happens to our societies and to our economies if it takes a year or even a year and a half to resolve. And things are going to fundamentally change in that case. So to help explore that question, this group of global futurists and experts and technologists and political scientists and civil servants came together online and identified around 200 different connections using a tool which my contribution for this personally was using a tool which I developed during my PhD at MIT, which enables large-scale scenario planning with many people in a distributed fashion, and developed these three scenarios. And it's important to emphasize that these three scenarios take place inside an existing context of quite fragile circumstances, it turns out. So they identified four major pre-existing contexts in which the virus is exacerbating things. The first is the gig economy, right? There's this phrase, the entrenchment of the gig economy, and that turns out to have been promised to provide flexibility for all of us, but actually is providing a significant degree of risk. If you look at historically at the economic performance of the United States, for example, and the United States is perhaps an extreme example here. In the 10 years between 2005 and 2015, almost 95% of all the jobs that were created were temporary jobs, were in the gig economy. So that's a huge sector of the economy. And the impact now today, before the virus hit, almost 1/3 of all Americans had no money, no savings, like zero savings. And about 2/3 of them had less than 1 month available savings for an emergency. So you have this combination of no contract workplace insecurity, and lack of savings, which has put a lot of people in a very dangerous position. At a time when, again, in the United States, and this expresses itself differently in various national contexts, but at a time where, in general, there's a real hardening of attitudes and perhaps a distrust of the public service. There's this sense of nationalism that is expressing itself in anger, not just towards the civil servants and towards government, but towards different groups of people in society. It's hard to say how that's related, if one's leading to the other, but the West, if I could use that term, so Western Europe and North America, are also in the middle of a severe epidemic of depression, anxiety, and mental illness. So drug abuse, suicide, domestic violence are all at extremely high levels. And there's this sense of existential fatigue, which many people experience, that leaves you emotionally fragile in the context of this. And all of which is taking place in the context of deep and pervasive digital surveillance. Now, the surveillance element has both positive and negative sides to it, but the positive being, that is what Google and Facebook is built upon. This is about detailed targeting of our desires and our wants and our wishes to help us, pick a better movie. But that same infrastructure is being used by companies like Palantir and Clearview and many others to develop sophisticated sorting and tracking for better or for worse. So these are the contexts this group identified, and I think that's important because you can't really talk about the future without talking about the past. So into that context, boom, we have coronavirus. And there's a lot of uncertainty around the coronavirus, right? The two things which are going to be critical about how long this crisis lasts is how rapidly and how fast do we develop long-term immunity. You probably have heard the phrase herd immunity. And how fast do we develop a vaccine? Now, on the first part, there is very little evidence around how well we develop vaccines if we get, how well we develop immunity if we get infected. The best research going on around this is looking at what they're called serological studies, and there's a big one happening in the Netherlands. They're starting to roll out in China now. The US is talking about one, but you're basically measuring the presence of antibodies in the bloodstream of a large population to determine if you get coronavirus, what are the chances that you develop an immunity to it, and how long does that immunity last? We just don't know. And there are some people who argue that we're not developing immunity to it after we're being exposed to it, which would mean we have to rely on a vaccine, which the smartest, best, most honest epidemiologists and medical professionals are saying wouldn't happen at least for 12 months, if not potentially for 18 months, to distribute globally at the scale that we're talking about, particularly when you start to see the kind of economic activism which many countries are starting to deploy around cornering the market on these vaccines. So if that's the case, right, then there's this question that we might face either a sustained period of lockdown, or as the Imperial College epidemiology study identified here in this graph, we might face repeated periods of lockdown. So as, for example, we go into the summer and then into the fall, we might relax our quarantine measures and to a degree, and then the disease, since we don't have immunity potentially, nor do we have a vaccine, might start to resurge again, and then we'll have to lock down again. And ideally, we would have a high degree of high resolution around this. We'd be able to only lock down, for example, regions or cities or neighborhoods or the specific people if we have that degree of surveillance. But the reality is that if we face long-term periods or repeated periods of economic shutdown at this scale, then we could face dramatic transformations to our economy and society. So the purpose of this exercise is try to explore what that question might look like. And I want to be really clear on their behalf.
No, can I interrupt for a second? I'm just getting some feedback that the sound is not clear. So would it be possible to speak just a little slower? That might assist a little bit.
Sure. Yes, I apologize. Can you hear me? Is this a better sound quality now?
It's still a little cracky. I mean, we'll make it work, but I think if you just pace it.
Here, let me try to. Here, 1 second. Let me try to.
Maybe the computer itself might still be better. Yeah. Oh, I'll unmute.
Can you?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. This is so much better. Okay.
Much better.
Wow. Sorry, I should have interrupted earlier.
Great. So and apologies because I don't have the chat window here, so I can't see what people are saying. So is that framework clear? Because I think that framing point around if as many people think may possible, and this is not a prediction, but if indeed 12 months to 18 months of continuous or repeated lockdown for us to develop either immunity or vaccine, then we face a very different world. And there's some significant changes which might occur. Is that clear? Is that foundation clear? Because that's a different area of investigation here than has been traditionally explored with a lot of these post-COVID exercises. So here's what the group did. So the group identified 3 scenarios for Europe and North America based on these 4 existing trends: economic fragility and insecurity, this mental health, wellness epidemic, the surveillance infrastructure, and the sense of populism and nationalism, which many political dialogues are engaging in. All 3 of these scenarios begin with 2 fundamental points. The first is widespread unemployment. So you already start to see this in the United States, where aside from just businesses being shut down, the level of unemployment is going through the roof. So there's, I think, this week's estimate on U.S. unemployment applications is around 9 million. Historically, there's around 200,000 unemployment applications this time of year. So you're talking about orders of magnitude greater people out of work. There was a study which found that around 35% of people under the age of 35 in North America are already out of work. So you're talking about large-scale crippling of the economy, businesses shutting down, people being out of work, particularly impacting freelancers. So a lot of you guys might be freelancers, contractors, and small and medium-sized businesses who just don't have the pockets to be able to withstand this at all. So the medical context of this, as well as the economic challenge of this large-scale structural unemployment, it necessitates some form of profound state intervention. So some state leadership is going to be essential, especially after the crisis starts to abate. And this is both medical and economic. And it's going to blur, particularly in parts of the West or countries where there's been a historic separation between government and the state and the market and private sector. Those are going to have to blur because the market and the private sector is collapsing. So how these 2 things interact, right? The nature of government intervention and communities' responses are the key determinants of how scenarios are going to unfold. So the first scenario that they developed is called the pyramid. And this is a response which we're already starting to see in some countries, and this is just a representative image. Obviously, it's not attributed to the United States government or to Donald Trump. But this is where the government responds to enact policies which only benefits the few. So as small and medium companies go out of business, as contractors and freelancers go out of business, then the kinds of stimulus packages that might come out are going to be biased towards those who have deep political connections, who have an economy of scale, which enables them to, say, last a couple of weeks or months until the money comes in, or lobby for a greater piece of that pie. So this scenario foresees a steepening of the pyramid, economic concentration with a growing sense of inequality, which following that would be followed by a wave of mergers and acquisitions and automations that would even further concentrate that power in the hands of the few. This leaves most people then out of the benefits of state intervention, particularly in the context where public sector services like health and welfare, social security, etc., have been underfunded or defunded over the last couple of years through various austerity programs. So as these public services start to stretch and break, then people are going to really feel scared and angry and demand some sort of radical, dramatic intervention. Just as we've seen historically, there's going to be clever politicians or national civil servants who are going to ride this wave of discontent and use that to fuel the kind of underlying rhetoric of nationalist and populist dialogue, which has the potential to utterly demolish incumbent and moderate parties, particularly incumbent moderate parties in Europe who didn't respond fast enough to the onset of the virus. Like you see some of that in some Northern European countries right now. As that starts to play out, then you see poverty increasing, people getting more scared and more anxious and starting to take their frustrations out minority groups. And in particular, this was one of the things that surprised me, because I just wasn't paying that much attention to it, was the group identified in this scenario a spike in domestic violence. Part of that, I think, is caused by the fact that people are going to be stuck inside, but also the fueling of these angry sentiments of looking for someone to blame, and the just desperate poverty that many people will experience will drive an increase in will looking for something loud against. And you have a dangerous, angry, unstable situation, which governments are then able to step into to consolidate their political control even further, and introduce very radical measures. And you see some measures like this already being discussed. So, for example, the possible suspension of elections, temporary or ongoing martial law, the temporary or partial or full nationalization of key industries, border closures, censorship, media suspensions, expulsion potentially of non-residents, or all of these sorts of things are already starting to emerge in very small examples beforehand. But you could imagine that if we face a year or a year and a half of profound economic pain, coupled with a government response that didn't help very many people and exacerbated the fear, anger, and tension between people, then we would end up in this situation where the whole surveillance infrastructure is basically applied to administer this political control. How am I doing on timing? And
all right, I think if we can wrap up in about 6-7 minutes, that will give enough.
Okay, perfect. So I'll speed up a little bit.
Yeah.
The other two scenarios are focused on what they call the village and the Leviathan. So this scenario is, imagine the government just can't or won't try to step in and provide for public services. So that could be because the capabilities of government and public services have been eviscerated. They spend too much time arguing over what to do about it. There's too many embedded interests. And so as a result, the economy just continues to contract, support services disappear, and there's no consolidation of political power at the top. So this basically means we have to rely on ourselves. And this becomes a world where in which we have a lot of hacks, of DIY solutions. You have gray and black market solutions, maybe local currencies, resource banks. You know, we're all beginning to become more dependent on our local neighborhood and more dependent on each other. And this has positive benefits. We know our neighbors better. We spend more time with our families. We band together and develop new skills. But as historically small scale societies and villages can be found to be, this can be very precarious and unviolent. Right? We might grow our own food, we might be more self-reliant and therefore more confident in ourselves, but also much more fragile. Any sense of crisis or any disruption could devastate the community. So small shocks make it more vulnerable, and the force to low consumption sustainable practice is going to be potentially very painful. As a result, the world in this case would become much more fragmented and volatile and indeed tribal. So this is a place where being different would be very tough, right? Local communities become more conservative, groups band together based on ethnic or religious lines as they protect themselves and take care of themselves, and overall trade falls, science innovation falls, and people are just focused on getting by. The third scenario here is similar to the first scenario in that government steps up and seizes control aggressively, but does so in the interest of as many people as possible, in the interest of the public. So you see some governments using a wartime rhetoric right now. So this is governments shifting into a wartime perspective, but they use the power that they consolidate to invest heavily in public sector basic needs. So this has two faces potentially, one of which is just a range of next generation regeneration projects. So these are everything like sustainable energy infrastructure, new transport, localized food and urban agriculture, revitalized healthcare systems, a revitalized public and network of digital services and using the internet as a public utility, climate resiliency, all the things that we know we have to do to survive the 21st century challenges of climate change. They take the opportunity now to invest heavily in these basic needs sectors. And they do so at a grand scale. But they also work with local communities to develop local solutions. So they encourage experimentation, and the whole society is mobilized towards a set of common goals, kind of operating as a bit of a directed government as a platform. So you see this as hackathons and grant-making challenges and venture challenges and design exercises, all of which are rewarded, funded, financed, and guided by the government. This is a model which we try to pursue in the UAE right now, even pre-crisis. So this stabilizes the situation after a year or so of being under quarantine and the economic devastation that would occur, and lays a foundation for post-crisis recovery, but would require significant personal sacrifice. So in this case, this becomes a model that's a little bit more akin to Singapore or China, where personal luxuries and individual freedoms in times of crisis are sacrificed for the needs of the many, for the greater needs. And this is enforced both explicitly through government intervention and fines, but also socially as well through social compliance mechanisms. You know, the group felt that this would pay off in the end. We would have then the foundation for a new and better society. And over time, the constraints could loosen and society could open up again. But the pain and the consequences of having to enforce this militarization of society to regenerate and get through this challenge would have long-term consequences, particularly from this kind of ideological uniformity, but also just economically. The cost of raising taxes and accruing so much public debt and printing money would have real long-term consequences. So as things start to open up, you'd have a counter movement to try to bring things back to normal. I'll skip this little summary here, but to wrap up, you know, I think that when I first heard these scenarios, it raised some really provocative questions, because if we accept the potential that we might be under a year or a year and a half more of lockdown, which would fundamentally devastate and or transform the economy, and these three possible pathways of like basically economic exploitation, DIY, village level, take care of ourselves, versus large-scale military style organization towards a new sustainable economy, you know, all three of those have pros and cons. They have strengths and weaknesses, and they raise some really interesting questions, which I hope we have the chance to get into in the session just after. So, you know, thank you for the time for this. I'm really curious to hear what you hear. As I mentioned, I've just had the chance to be a part of this group, this international futurist group, and this is the first time they've shared this globally. So I'm sure they'd be interested in hearing your thoughts as well on what does this mean for you.
No, there are some comments to show the summary, and I agree. I think it will be a nice, punchy.
Oh, you want to see the summary?
Yeah, I think it's a good matrix.
Okay. So just to wrap up, I guess to summarize, the three scenarios have different benefits and costs in each. So if you look just vertically here, we have the first scenario, the pyramid, which is the consolidation of power for the elite. The second scenario is the village, which is just basically no consolidation of power. Everybody has to take care of themselves. And the last is Leviathan, which is a consolidation of power for the benefit of as many people as possible. So these little emojis kind of represent the potential impacts and feelings of these worlds. And of course, it would vary by our hometown and our city and our country. So some of the questions are around how might this apply to our own homes. But you know, the society in the first scenario is very fraught. It's very scary. It's very anxious. It's scary. Some people are getting really rich in the economy, but most people aren't. So it's a kind of a cowboy, dog eat dog, take what you can world. The environment goes on fire. I mean, you see that already in some countries. They're loosening and or peeling back environmental regulations in the interest of economic security. And politics are angry and confrontational and violent. Technology is represented by these swords is designed to enforce control and minimize disruption. In the village, you know, it's got this sort of clenched teeth emoji, because you know, you're getting by, but at any given moment, you know, it's hard and it might not work out. The economy is basically dead. You know, we're all in self-sustenance mode. The environment is recovering because consumption is much lower, but also, as we see in many lesser developed countries, the resource intensity on the environment in local places is very high. So you're talking about chopping down your trees and, you know, trying to grow food in the middle of intersections and whatnot. Politics is, you know, the snake here. I think they use a snake to represent, you know, it's thorny, it's defensive politics here. You might be strong and trusting within your community, but you're always on the lookout against foreigners or your neighbors. And the technology is very utilitarian and practical. In the last scenario, the Leviathan, you know, this is a sort of a cautious optimism because the economy does recover. There's vast investments in new economic sectors. There's universal basic income experiments, as we're seeing in Spain. But, you know, you don't necessarily get to express your freedom of thought as strongly as we might previously. Not everyone gets to do what they want to do. You know, certain industries might not be as important or free anymore. And the economy is very much organized like a a bee colony, right? There, it's top down, essentially directed. You know, there's small scale innovation therein, but it's organized more along the lines of a large military organization. This has long-term benefits for the environment in terms of sustainability, but politics are very much like alpha male. There's the government, you know, and they're defining the terms, and the technology is all defined and used to build this new world. So this summary, I think, is kind of interesting. I'm glad you asked for it, but it starts to elaborate, like, each of these have pros and cons, and it's more, you know, it's not just the classic, does the economy go back to normal, like this 2-axis graph. You know, there's a third or even a fourth or a fifth axis here, whereas the world starts to take on different flavors and characters that might be more exciting for some of us in some places and more terrifying for others of us in other places.
Great, and I think this is also relevant. I think the reason I want to go into this is because that way people will have a better understanding of its nuances, which will make the breakout rooms more productive. So I think the other 2x2 or the 2-axis thing, do you want to also quickly elaborate on that? Yeah.
Yeah, so this just describes the different pathways, I believe. So, you know, one axis here is of political power. So both scenario 1, the pyramid, and the Leviathan are both concentrated, they're up on the political power scale, so they have concentrated political power. But the horizontal axis is who benefits from that. So in the pyramid, it's the elites who benefit from that concentration of political and economic power. Whereas in the Leviathan world, it's the public which benefits in the long run from that. You know, the village is kind of halfway in between. It's the failure of political concentration of power. So power is just diffused. And depending on who you were before this, so if you had economic reserves, if you live in a sustainable neighborhood already, or it's easier to convert, or you're in a more homogenous environment where you trust your neighbors and know each other well, then you might do okay for your community. But if you're outside of that, you might have a real hard time. So this is kind of halfway in between benefiting the elites and the incumbents versus the public for the village. I should say one more thing too, just sort of professional responsibility, provocateur here. So, you know, it's always important that as you start to take these scenarios, these are designed to be balanced pathways for what might happen. All of them are meant to be roughly equally plausible. So it's not like which one is more likely than the other. Although in some environments or some countries or some cities, one might be more likely, or you might even be living in a version of one right now. But these aren't predictions. These are designed, if you get back to the very beginning, these are designed as frameworks, as mental models for us to start to try to make sense of the way the world is changing and the way the news is occurring, and start to reflect on in our own decisions in our own lives. Like, it's not like anything is possible if, on a broad brush sense, these 3 scenarios capture not everything, but 3 quite plausible major pathways of evolution for Europe and North America. And again, it's impossible to say something like Europe as one entity, but if you hold these 3 things in your head, I think what I found is I've started to read these scenarios and get more familiar with them, because I start to see seeds of each of these in the news every day. So when the news comes in, I say, oh, look, that's scenario 1. Like, that's an example of, you know, for example, in the United States, right now the military is seizing medical supplies and face masks from suppliers, and then consolidating them in certain private sector suppliers who are selling them back onto the profit, right? Like, that's economic exploitation. That's a scenario 1. In other cases like Spain, for example, they're talking about developing universal basic income. That's a scenario 3. So you can start to have these kind of these thumbnail sketches which help make sense of the complexity of the world. And what I find personally, and hopefully this is what people who work with these sort of scenarios start to develop, is it also lowers your sense of anxiety, because you start to have a framework not for predicting what the future will be like, but for understanding how it might be like. And therefore that gives you a sort of opening up of your heart and your mental space to stop trying to figure out the big picture all the time, and just focus on what your small and medium scale life might be like in the context of these larger possibilities. So these aren't predictions, these are just possibilities.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Noah. So I think it's a good time to switch to the interactive part of the conversation. For this, let me just share my screen.